Welcome back to Demystifying Blockchain, where today we'll be talking about cryptography. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Julia. So, cryptography is one of the foundational building blocks that blockchain technologies and most modern distributed systems technologies leverage in order to secure their communication and develop protocols and algorithms that allow different people to communicate over untrusted communication channels. So cryptography is both a field of mathematics as well as a field of computer science, and in some cases information theory as well. It has a very rich history. So there's been many movies, around Alan Turing and World War II and the Enigma machine and the cryptography used in World War II and World War I, and recently, within the past few decades, cryptography as a science has blossomed, and now we're sort of in a modern renaissance of cryptography, where we have many people and mathematicians and computer scientists all over the world developing new forms of science and mathematics to develop new cryptographic tools to secure communication over insecure channels. And in terms of blockchain technology in particular, cryptography is finding a home in actual practical systems that are being built, many of them using this blockchain type architecture, whereas before cryptography was more of a sort of niche field that a few computer scientists and mathematicians had an interest in. Maybe there would, within a few government controlled settings that had very strict requirements regarding protecting information, there was interest there, but now it's becoming sort of mainstream, where cryptography is increasingly being built and deployed in all sorts of different technologies. But at a bird's eye view, it's a mathematics and a science or a study for developing techniques for securing communication and data in the presence of adversaries. So when you use the internet, the internet's designed in such a way where you have this sort of dumb networking layer that just kind of hands packages or envelopes between multiple parties with a source and destination, and there's no guarantees as to sort of what happens within the network in terms of what happens to your data when you send it off to be received by someone else. So it can be intercepted. People can view this data. It can be dropped. It can be reordered. And so cryptography is very important when using internet-based technologies to secure communication, so that you may be in a Wi-Fi hotspot at a coffee shop, for example, and there could be someone else on the same access point, and you want to make sure you can message your friends or do your banking or what have you without having the person next to you viewing all of your traffic and collecting your passwords, your information, or your messages. And so cryptography provides that capability so that you can send messages between people in a way that a adversary or a third person cannot decode them or intercept them. So this is encryption. So you're taking a message and you're performing a mathematical transformation and algorithm so that other people can't, if they do intercept it, they can't make sense of it. So that's one sort of key piece, encryption. And another is making sure that you are talking to the person you think you're talking to. So there's a sort of famous expression on the internet. Nobody knows you're a dog. So the way the internet's designed, it's just a dumb switching networking layer, and so it doesn't have much intelligence as to the source of the destination of messages or the traffic flows. It really is just a delivery system to take messages from point A to point B. And so the internet architecture doesn't really have an identity layer where you don't really know who you're talking to. And so cryptography is used to verify the identities, to make sure that it gives you the ability to make sure that when you type in HTTPS, google.com, you are talking to google.com, to Google over here in Mountain View, and not some other nefarious person that might be intercepting your traffic and trying to collect information about you. And so that's identity, and making sure that you are validating that the messages you send are being sent and received only by the person you think they are. And then another sort of factor of cryptography or theme is integrity. So being able to tell if someone has tampered with the messages you're sending. So if you think you order something on Amazon.com, it comes in this nice box, and for some products, they'll have tamper-proof sort of seals on the box, so that if someone did intercept your package and opened it up and replaced your product with something else, you would be able to tell. And so integrity in the cryptography world are additional metadata, you can say, that you add to your communication, so that you can detect if someone has tampered with the messages you're sending. So you don't want to be able to have an adversary to sort of interject or themselves in your communication with your peer and modify the things you're saying, or possibly it could be removing things that you were saying. So maybe you send a message that says, I do not need help, and they remove the not part, and the receiver receives I need help, which is sort of the opposite of what you intended to send. So integrity provides these checks so that you can detect if someone has been tampering with your communication and that they receive everything you intended them to receive. So those are the three broad themes that cryptography explores. And so now we'll dive in a little bit into these themes in more detail and some of the actual tools and technologies that are used to accomplish these things. So, as I said, so in cryptography, there's a lot of thought experiments and to talk through difficult concepts. And so generally, these thought experiments involve people. So you have two people, Alice and Bob, that are communicating with each other. And then you have a third person, Eve, who's the eavesdropper. So Eve is the eavesdropper, and she is listening in on this communication. And so suppose Alice and Bob want to communicate over an insecure channel, like the internet, and Eve is eavesdropping and intercepting and possibly changing the messages. So the first thing you want to make sure that cryptography, this is all sort of the goals of cryptography, is confidentiality. So you want a communication mechanism or a communication system where nobody but Alice and Bob can decode or read the messages. So you don't want Eve listening in and seeing your bank account information when Alice is talking to her bank, Bob, let's say. So that's confidentiality. The second one is integrity. So we mentioned this. If you want, Alice and Bob need to be able to detect if their messages are tampered with. So this is the Amazon metaphor with the tamper-proof box. You want to be able to tell if Eve has changed the messages in some way. And then the third is authenticity. So you want to make sure that the message was only from Alice and only from Bob. So Alice and Bob need to be sure that they're talking to the people that they think they're talking to each other, and not Eve pretending to be Bob, let's say, or Alice. And so a crypto system are the different parts of the system that are needed to implement a security service. Typically, there's a lot of focus on confidentiality, the encryption piece. So there are different types of crypto systems that combine different types of mathematics and algorithms. But generally, a large focus of cryptography is the confidentiality. So in addition to the integrity and authenticity, confidentiality is sort of paramount. Being able to encrypt messages so that only Alice and Bob can read them. So in a crypto system, just some terminology here. You have messages. These are just the messages being sent between Alice and Bob. There's a plain text form of the message, and that is what Alice and Bob read. That's what they can read. So that's the unencoded or unencrypted original form of the message. There's something called a ciphertext. That is the encoded or the encrypted form of the message. So this is after you've taken your plain text and you've run this encryption algorithm, and the output of that encryption algorithm is this ciphertext that only Alice and Bob can read. You have an encryption program, and generally encryption programs, they take a message and they take a key. What is a key? It's some kind of secret information that either only Alice knows or only Bob knows, or both Alice and Bob know. But it's a secret that so the encryption program will take a key and it'll take a plain text message, and then there'll be a decryption program that takes a decryption key, possibly the same key, and takes a ciphertext, so an encoded message, and it outputs the plain text message given those two things. So these are sort of the building blocks and terminology of a crypto system. In this case, one that's providing confidentiality. So again, you have messages that can be plain text or ciphertext. You have an encryption program that takes an encryption key and a plain text message, and you have a decryption program that takes a decryption key and a ciphertext message. So an important thing to understand in cryptography, or an important concept, is that in this kind of crypto system description, cryptography is only concerned with maintaining the secrecy of the key and not the algorithms. So the algorithms, the program, those are all assumed to be well known and understood. So there's a concept called, in eras past, before the renaissance of cryptography we have now, there was a concept of security through obscurity, where you not only share some secret key, but maybe the algorithms themselves are also kept secret. And that concept has been rejected now in modern security and cryptography thinking. So you assume that the algorithms are known, that everyone knows the algorithms. Eve knows what algorithm or what protocol you're using to encrypt and decrypt messages, but she doesn't know the keys. So the cryptographic problem as formulated in the modern formulation involves keeping the keys secret, whereas the algorithms and the protocols are all assumed to be well known. And that's because in general it's a lot harder to protect algorithms, and they end up getting leaked out anyway or reverse engineered. And so cryptographers sort of have given up on this approach of trying to keep the algorithms themselves a secret. So the algorithms are all assumed to be public knowledge, and it's just the keys. This secret. So key is just some secret. You can think of it as another secret message, or a random message that's randomly generated usually. But it's something that only Alice and Bob. It's a piece of information that only Alice or Bob know. And so modern cryptography really is about protecting these secret keys and not trying to hide the algorithm or protect the algorithm. The algorithm is known and understood. And as a consequence of this as well, it promotes a culture where people try to they publicize their algorithms, which creates an environment where people, through publications and through discussion, can critique and develop better algorithms, as opposed to keeping your algorithm secret, which may have mistakes that you haven't thought through yet. So, high level, that's really the focus of cryptography, is developing algorithms that assume the keys are kept secret, but the algorithms are publicly known. Now, there's a similar related field called information security, which is more of a practical field where it's typically a group or a team within an enterprise company that uses cryptographic tools and cryptography to protect information within a company. And so it's a related field, but it's much more of a applied field of taking mathematics and tools that have been developed within the realm of cryptography and applying them into your company in order to enforce company policies and protect company information. So information security, InfoSec, uses cryptography to maintain confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Availability, this is a new concept, but what that means is data and services are available to authorized parties when they're needed. So it's a related field to cryptography that uses cryptography to primarily enforce confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements throughout your company. Now, cryptography and confidentiality. Going back to confidentiality, there's two sort of broad categories, or types, I should say, of encryption and cryptography in general. So you have there's what's called symmetric and asymmetric cryptography. And when we talk about confidentiality and encryption, going back to our example, so in our example we had Alice and Bob, and there's an encryption algorithm that took a plain text message and a key, and a decryption algorithm that took a ciphertext message and another key, right? And in symmetric cryptography, that key is the same. So you use the same key to encrypt a message as you use to decrypt the message. In asymmetric cryptography, those keys are different. So you use one key to encrypt a message, and you use a different key to decrypt the message. And that different key it's different. So you end up with a pair of keys. And generally speaking, this pair of keys, one is called the public key, and the other is called the private key. And we'll dive into that a little more later in the session. But going back to symmetric, where the keys are the same, in that case, both Alice and Bob share the key, and they're responsible for keeping that key secret. So it's the same key. Both Alice has one and Bob has one, a copy of it. It's the same key. If Alice was sending the message to Bob, then she would take her message, the plain text, pass it to this encryption algorithm, pass this shared secret key, that would output a ciphertext. She would then use the network, this untrusted network, to deliver this ciphertext message to Bob. Bob would then receive the ciphertext, and then Bob, it now takes this key, the same key that Alice had, and he then runs the decrypt algorithm with the ciphertext and the shared key, and reconstructs the plaintext, the original plaintext message. And so, the important thing, it's symmetric, the keys are the same. The encrypt and decrypt operation both take the same keys. Now, that poses other questions like, how do Alice and Bob share this key if you have an untrusted network to begin with, right? And so in the simplest way, and in ages past, the way they would share that key is they would meet in person. So they would actually get together in person, and they would agree, okay, this is the secret key, and physically have some, a piece of paper, or they might copy it on their electronic devices, what have you, but they would have to meet physically and not use the network to transfer this secret key, because they need to keep it a secret. And it's common to both of them. And that is not ideal. In ages past, this opens up a world of couriers where you have, people that are trusted to deliver messages between Alice and Bob, and they have to keep the secret close to them, and sort of tamper-proof briefcases, and so you can picture the courier who's got the briefcase with the secret, handcuffed to his hand, and then gets on the plane, and it's very expensive and difficult to keep these keys a secret, and it becomes a physical protection problem where you're trying to physically protect these secret keys, which can be challenging in a global world where people are so, they want to communicate across the world. And so that motivated a desire for the development of asymmetric cryptography, sometimes called public key cryptography. And the first one we just described with the shared key, that's called symmetric, just a reminder. And then this new type, it's a newer type of cryptography. So symmetric has, it has a much longer history, whereas everything going all the way back down to, the pharaohs and stuff, having simple, substitution ciphers, and it goes back thousands of years. Some asymmetric cryptography, public key cryptography, is a more recent development. Depending on, who you ask, it seems to have been developed originally in secret, kind of at the end of World War II with GCHQ, but it was publicly developed independently in the 70s and 80s. And it just so happened that within the past few years, more information has come out that, within some of these intelligence agencies, they had developed public key cryptography earlier, but it wasn't publicly known until the 70s and 80s, where these are names like Whit Diffie, Martin Hellman, Ralph Merkle. These are sort of the pioneers. This is mainly out of sort of Stanford and the Bay Area. These are pioneers of public key cryptography, or asymmetric cryptography. And going into asymmetric cryptography, so here both parties have different keys. So Alice generates a public key, what's called a public key, and a key called a private key. So Alice has a public and private, and Bob similarly generates a public key and a private key. So in terms of the whole system, you now end up with 4 different keys. And the way it works is when Alice is encrypting a message for Bob, she will use Bob's public key. And so the public keys, what's interesting about them is that they don't need to be kept secret. Public keys can be shared to the whole world. So Alice would have, suppose she has Bob's public key shared to the whole world. Bob doesn't need to keep the public key a secret. When she encrypts the message for Bob, this new type of asymmetric encryption would take Bob's public key and the plain text, it'll encrypt it, and it'll generate a ciphertext. Bob receives this ciphertext, and then now Bob uses his private key to decrypt. So the decrypt algorithm takes a private key that is kept private, that only Bob knows, and Bob uses that to decrypt and construct the original plain text message. Similarly, when Bob is sending a message to Alice, Bob would use Alice's public key to encrypt the message for Alice. So Alice's public key is public. The public keys are all known by everyone. And he would then encrypt it with Alice's public key, send the ciphertext to Alice, and then Alice would receive it, use her private key, and use that to decrypt it. And that's really nice because now you don't have this problem of Alice and Bob needing to share a secret key. The only keys that Alice and Bob use to encrypt messages are public. They can be broadcast to the whole world, and so that's a pretty amazing thing that was developed only in the past few decades. And it's great for the internet and global types of communication because it doesn't require Alice and Bob now to kind of get together and share a secret. So taking a step back, there's some more terminology. There's a field called cryptanalysis, or it's part of cryptography, but it's a way of deciphering an encrypted message without having the key. So it's a field of mathematics and statistics where you attempt to sort of break these encryption algorithms. So being able to take the ciphertext and try to decode the original without actually having the key, or trying to discover the key. And just so we're aware of some terminology there are sort of 2 broad different types of cryptanalysis. There's what's called differential, where you look at how different inputs to the encryption affect the output. So you have some encryption black box with its own key, and then somehow you either observe or you set your own inputs. Maybe you trick Alice into encrypting a bunch of messages with her key, and then you look at the outputs, and you carefully craft these inputs and look at the outputs and do some statistical analysis to then detect patterns and try to decode the original key. And then there's another approach called linear, where you can formulate your encryption algorithm as a set of linear equations that sort of approximate the encryption algorithm, and then solve for these to try to decode your key. This is getting a little too technical, but the point is, there's the field of sort of breaking these encryption algorithms is called cryptanalysis, and there's generally these 2 different kind of approaches to cryptanalysis to try to break these encryption algorithms. So cryptography, it's always a cat and mouse game where it's never done. So you always have attackers and defenders that are competing against each other, and as a result, developing stronger and better technologies through this game. Yeah, cryptanalysis is that field of trying to break these algorithms. Now, going back, so let's talk a little bit about some algorithms or technologies themselves. So going back to symmetric encryption. So again, this is confidentiality. This is trying to protect your message, Alice and Bob, where they have a shared key. The sort of industry standard is an algorithm called AES, which stands for Advanced Encryption Standard. It's set by, so there's a group called NIST in the US, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. There's another group called FIPS, the Federal Information Processing Standards. There's a group, an international group called ISO, International Organization for Standardization. But they all, these are all different groups that sort of set these standards. They set the protocols. They define sort of best practices, how to, recommendations. And for AES 256, it's one standard that's been adopted by these groups that performs this encryption. AES. Now, AES comes in a few different flavors. There's a AES 128. The 128 just means the size. It refers to the size of your keys. Where the larger your key is, these keys. Okay, so taking a step back, the keys that we were talking about, they're created randomly. So you don't want to generate keys in a deterministic way where someone else can use that deterministic way to then try to uncover your keys. So keys should be random or incorporate randomness in them. And in many of these cryptographic algorithms, the longer your key, the more random your key, the more powerful the algorithm, the harder it is for an attacker to break the algorithm. So AES, this symmetric encryption algorithm, comes in two flavors. It comes in AES 128 and AES 256. And the 128 and 256 really just refer to the size of these keys. There's these international standards that govern the definition of AES and the size of these keys. And the way AES works is a little more technical, but there's this concept of an S box. But basically, you end up kind of taking the key and the ciphertext and running through. You scramble. You can think. You can scramble the bits of your original message in such a way that it's a deterministic algorithm. The algorithm is well known, but by scrambling the bits in this way using these S boxes, it's very difficult for cryptanalysis to decode the key. Anyway, so it's a block, what they call block cipher algorithm, and it comes in these two different flavors. One interesting aside is within the U.S., like up until I believe late 80s, maybe even early 90s, encryption algorithms like AES and cryptography in general were treated as ammunitions. So the U.S. had a lot of laws and regulations controlling how cryptographic algorithms and technologies were distributed around the globe. So if you were a U.S. company and you were using AES 256 in one of your products, you wouldn't actually be able to just go out and sell your product to some other country. You would have to go through a registration process, an approval process, because it was treated as an ammunition, like a weapon. Just how like U.S. Military contractors, when they develop new types of bombs, they can't just go and sell them without regulation and restriction. That's how cryptography was treated up until only a few decades ago. And now with this renaissance, those restrictions have been removed, and you're just seeing an explosion of new technologies being developed and actually applied within blockchain technologies. Another aside is crypto. People use the term crypto to describe like cryptocurrencies, and that's sort of a shame because crypto is short for cryptography, and cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum and Monero and all the ones we talked about in earlier sessions, they use cryptography to secure their networks. But yeah, crypto is short for cryptography and not for cryptocurrency. So going back to this key exchange problem, which motivated asymmetric cryptography. So with the symmetric, it kind of raises problems. How do parties exchange the keys so that no one else gets a copy? Because with the symmetric, you need to have some separate secure channel through these couriers that we talked about. And that led to this key exchange problem. So that is a key exchange problem, is how you share these keys, which led to this asymmetric cryptography, most popularly known, made famous by Diffie and Martin Hellman, and the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which is still used this was developed in the 70s and 80s, and this is still used in almost all public key cryptography today. And it relies, without going too deep in how these algorithms actually work, at a high level, they rely on certain mathematically difficult operations that are hard to invert. So you perform some function, some mathematical function, that without a secret, it becomes very hard to invert the function. And generally, with public key, this is public key cryptography, mind you. So with asymmetric and public key cryptography, generally the two mathematical problems that they build on that are easy to compute but difficult to invert are what's called the discrete logarithm problem and the integer factorization problem. So the discrete logarithm problem is where you have an equation like b to the x to the power of x equals a, and given the number b to the x and a, you're trying to compute an integer x. So you're trying to compute the logarithm of that formula without where the logarithm is an integer. Similarly, integer factorization is where you have typically a very large number, and you're trying to break that number into smaller factors. So in some cases, there's the prime factorization theorem, where every number can be broken down into its prime constituents, and the integer factorization problem is similar to that, where you have a very large number and you're trying to find, in most cases, two smaller numbers, p and q, that when multiplied equals that large number. So these are functions which, if you know the answer to them, then in the discrete log problem, the x, it's easy to verify that your answer is correct. Same with the integer factorization. If you know the p and the q equals, let's say p times q equals m. If you know p and you know q, you can just multiply them and check to see if it equals m. So it's easy to verify if you have the right answer. But if you only know p times q, then it's really difficult, or m. It's really difficult to find p and q and to factor that number. And so public key cryptography is built on this type of mathematics. So these functions that are easy to compute but hard to invert. And public key cryptography, also asymmetric crypto, they're synonymous. It's generally speaking, it's more computationally difficult than symmetric cryptography. So symmetric cryptography uses these things like I mentioned before, called S boxes, which kind of mix these bits together, and it's very fast. You can do it very quickly. Asymmetric cryptography is much slower. And so in practice, you end up with, when you actually build systems that use these technologies, generally the way it works is the system, like when you hear technologies like TLS or HTTPS, these are technologies, or SSH, SSL, these are all technologies that our computers use to communicate securely over the internet. When you type in HTTPS, www.google.com, it's using TLS, and that algorithm uses public key cryptography. But in addition, generally, because public key cryptography can be slow, these protocols like TLS end up using combinations of public key cryptography and symmetric cryptography. So TLS, for example, there'll be an initial step where it uses public key cryptography, like this Diffie-Hellman stuff that I mentioned earlier, and the message that gets exchanged is actually a shared secret key. So you use public key cryptography, the expensive thing, to share an actual secret key, to do the step of the courier. And then once both Alice and Bob have the shared secret key, then you're now using symmetric cryptography to then encrypt the remainder of the messages. So, encryption systems as used today combine both symmetric and asymmetric cryptography. This is a field called crypto engineering. So this is taking these different building blocks, these mathematical tools, and combining them in secure ways. So you need to prove correctness of these things, and in a way that has good performance that you can actually use. So it's actually practical, and that's what our computers are actually using. So so SSL, this is a technology that predates HTTPS as it's used today. It was originally in the Netscape browser. There's a tool called SSH, which people use today still to connect to remote servers, and that uses SSL, but it stands for Secure Sockets Layer. It was developed in about 1994, 1995, and it uses this asymmetric symmetric type algorithm. It was then improved, sort of the next version called TLS, Transport Layer Security, and TLS also provided confidentiality where you can encrypt the messages between Alice and Bob, but in addition, it offered additional authentication pieces where it can verify that Alice is Alice and Bob is Bob. So it's sort of improved upon SSL, and it's used today in HTTPS. When you type in HTTPS, www.google.com, it's using TLS. And then VPN software, modern VPN software uses this TLS as well as part of that. Now, so we've covered symmetric and asymmetric cryptography in a large amount of detail, but I really want to touch upon a few other areas of cryptography to not leave you with the impression that all cryptography is about confidentiality and encryption and decryption of messages. It's certainly an important part, but there are other pieces here too. And so one concept I want to mention is a concept called hash functions, cryptographic hash functions. This is used, we've talked about it in previous sessions regarding blockchain technology. It's used so a hash function will take a large message, a variable size message, it could be huge, and it'll convert that into a succinct, what's called message digest. Sometimes it's called a signature, but it's a much smaller fixed size message that is a unique representation of that larger message that has certain mathematical properties, mainly if it's typically fast to compute. It shouldn't take long to generate this digest. And if someone alters the original message and computes the digest again, they'll get a different digest. So you can think of it as a succinct representation of a much larger message. And there's a lot of cryptographic work has been developed to compute these hash functions in a secure way. And so there's a few different algorithms like the SHA-1 family. There's these family of algorithms that these standards bodies that I mentioned, like NIST, the NSA, National Security Agency from the U.S. has developed standards and recommendations. So you have SHA-1, you have a SHA-2 family, and then there's older ones called MD5. These are just algorithms that compute hash functions that are cryptographically secure, meaning they behave. If you alter the original message, you will compute a different hash function. Similarly, if you just have the digest, it's virtually impossible to uncover the original message. So there's certain security properties regarding these hash functions, but it's an area of cryptography that's especially important. It's becoming increasingly important because asymmetric cryptography, I mentioned this discrete logarithm problem and integer factorization. Well, it turns out quantum computers can solve these problems, integer factorization and discrete log. They have the speed up over traditional deterministic models of computation. And so there is a concern that with the advent of quantum computers, much modern cryptography, asymmetric cryptography, could be susceptible to attacks and no longer be secure because they would be able to do things like an integer factorization and discrete log. They'd be able to solve those problems faster than traditional non-quantum computers could. And whereas symmetric algorithms, these older algorithms, and hash functions, which that don't depend on these mathematical hardness assumptions, there aren't known quantum speedups. So sometimes they're referred to as quantum resistant algorithms. So there's been a resurgence of interest recently in going back to hash functions and symmetric cryptography, the older cryptography that people have been doing for thousands of years, going back to that and revisiting it to see how they can make quantum resistant algorithms that wouldn't suffer from possible quantum attacks in the future. Now, there's not massive quantum computers, sitting somewhere today that anyone's aware of, but people are, they're trying to plan for the future because you may be storing messages. Someone may be collecting messages, right? So someone might be collecting a bunch of messages and then waiting, 10, 20 years from now when there are quantum computers that could then break and decode those messages, right? So it's a problem that people are focusing a lot on today. So there's a group within Google, for example, that's looking at quantum resistant algorithms and alternatives to public key cryptography that we talked about. And then the only other thing I want to mention too is the concept of digital signatures. So we talked about encryption and encrypting messages, but in order to guarantee authenticity, I know this message came from Alice. Bob knows that it receives a message that it thinks is from Alice. Bob can verify that yes, it was from Alice. Public key cryptography, it's also used to generate what's called digital signatures, which are small metadata attached to a message that Bob can use to validate that the message was actually constructed using Alice's private key. So only the person with Alice's private key. So the same way that encryption uses public and private keys, digital signature algorithms use public and private keys. And Bob can verify that this signature attached to this message that was encrypted to me was generated by the person who has Alice's private key. So Bob can know that indeed the message was from Alice. So asymmetric encryption or asymmetric cryptography doesn't only cover encryption and confidentiality, but it covers authentication as well, where you can use the same types of algorithms to construct signatures, digital signatures, which are then used. So there's a public and private key, like you have in encryption, and where these signatures are used to validate the authenticity of the message. So that was a lot of topics. I think it would probably be best to pause here and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Sam. Yes, I do have one question. More in the beginning, you were talking about cryptanalysis, and I was wondering what it is actually used for. So is it only for hacking and countering hacking, or are there any other uses as well?
It's mainly the field of trying to break these encryption algorithms. So it's a whole field of mathematics. So cryptography is sort of this cat and mouse push and pull game where people develop new types of encryption that might be more efficient, that might be ostensibly more secure, and at the same time, other people or the same people are trying to break that. And so the field of trying to take these encryption algorithms where you know the algorithm, the key, and then apply statistical methods, maybe machine learning now. But traditionally, there's a sort of differential and linear approach. That's a field that tries to break these encryption algorithms and come up with mathematics to break the algorithm, which then leads to improvements in the algorithm or improvements in how the algorithm is used. So, for example, with this AES encryption algorithm, if you use a key to encrypt a message many different times, the same key, an observer who collects this information, they don't know the original message, they don't know the key, but they might be able to pull out information based on multiple applications of running AES 256 using statistical patterns. Additionally, they might know some background information about the messages, so they just might know that every time you send a message, Alice sends a message to Bob, he starts, she starts her message with "Dear Bob," right? And so the attacker, the person performing cryptanalysis, actually knows some additional information that, okay, the first few characters of this message are going to start "Dear Bob," and this is actually how in World War II the Enigma machine. So Enigma was a advanced machine for encrypting messages that the Germans had developed, and this is actually how that machine was broken by the Allied forces by knowing that certain messages always had certain characters in the beginning of the message, and then looking at the statistical properties to then sort of uncover the original keys. And so, it's just, I call it out because it's sort of a field to kind of mention that cryptography is sort of this push and pull where people come up with ideas, other people break those ideas, and then new cryptography is developed. It's never finished. It's always being developed and improved.
All right, great. Okay, that's it from my side. Thank you very much for the insightful session on cryptography.
Thank you.